in the chat box during the presentation. And of course, we'll do our best to make sure all questions are answered at the end of the presentation. So this week's presentation is from Dr. Kacie Athey. Dr. Athey is a University of Illinois assistant professor and extension specialist with the College of ACES' Crop Science Department. Her work contributes towards the understanding of non-chemical insect control within specialty crop systems that combines with field research of molecular gut content analysis to study practical insect control applications and arthropod food webs. Since joining University of Illinois in September 2020, Dr. Athey has worked to establish relationships with Illinois specialty growers, presented at field days and winter conferences, and implemented research projects at Dixon Springs and around the state. So please welcome Dr. Athey this week.
Thank you. What do you see? Do you see my title slide currently?
I do not. So you may need to do a new share at the bottom.
I thought maybe. Sorry about that. It is, let's see. I think it might be this one. Let's try that. That look right?
That looks right. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. So for this webinar, I wanted to talk a little about regenerative ag in general. So it's a word that you've probably heard a fair amount of, and it's a word that I've kind of been throwing around in some of my research recently. And so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time today going through what some of the different meanings of it and sort of what I think it means to me. But first, I will introduce you to my lab a bit and just talk just a tiny itty bitty bit about what we do as a whole in my laboratory. And then I'm going to go into, at the end, I'm going to talk a bit about a field trial that we started this summer in the context of regenerative ag and some of the results that we're getting so far and sort of the future directions for that. So let's see if I can advance my slides. All right, fantastic. So yeah, I've been at the University of Illinois since about August of 2020. And my lab is called the Specialty Crops Entomology Lab. And what we focus on as far as research is non-chemical control of insect pests. And this really falls under two blankets. The first one being biological control and the second one being cultural control. Last year for the winter webinar, I did do a webinar on biological control, and I talked a bit about some of the things that we were going to be doing this summer in that realm. For this one, because in the context of regenerative ag, some of the research that I'm doing is in this cultural control realm, which is just where you're sort of modifying the environment for pest control or for sustainability. That's what I'm mainly going to talk about today. And just to point out sort of what some of my pictures here are, I've got a picture of my lab as it was a couple of weeks ago. We now have another new member. And then up here, this picture of a stink bug eating, a spider eating a stink bug is just to show you biocontrol in action. And then down here is a picture of a study that I did in my PhD on cultural control, where we were using row covers and ground cover for control in squash and melon pests. But what I'm going to talk to you about quite a bit today, and what I'm going to continue here with, is cultural control and regenerative ag. So this term, regenerative agriculture, from what we can gather, sort of started to appear in the scientific literature and among farmers in the 1970s. And there was a little bit of research and a little bit of use of this word over about the next 10 years or so, but it really came into greater use in the 80s. And what I'm showing you here is you have this graph here, and this is actually showing news items using the term regenerative agriculture. And you can see that basically for 20 some years, 1980s, 1990s, there really was nothing to speak of. There was occasional blips in sort of news coverage, but not a lot about this particular topic. And so, you can see from that graph that a bit more started to happen in the 2010s, 2015s, and talk and news coverage and papers describing regenerative agriculture really seems to have taken off about 5 years ago. And you can see that I have that arrow there, and you can see where the graph really goes up from there. And so this was interest in regenerative ag, talk, and I would say that regenerative ag is kind of the buzzword of the moment. Up until this point, even though they are different things, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Up until this point, often we were using the term sustainability. And so we've kind of morphed into this regenerative agriculture blanket. So even though we're seeing all of this news coverage, and there's a fair amount of, think pieces and research papers kind of written on this subject, there is no agreed upon definition of regenerative agriculture at all. And I wanted to point out that this is in basically every sense of the word. So when we talk about some of these terms, you have the legal sense, a regulatory definition, and then sort of common usage. And regenerative ag doesn't have a definition in any of these contexts, not one that is agreed upon by pretty much anyone. And I like to compare this to the words organic and natural. So organic, of course, has a very clear legal definition and a very clear regulatory definition. If you say that you're growing organic, there are a bunch of laws and rules that you have to follow to be growing organic. Natural, on the other hand, doesn't actually have any meaning in either legal or regulatory, in either a legal or regulatory sense. Now, with organic, as with natural, there are different definitions in the common usage for those things. And so organic tends to be a term that, depending on who you're talking to, it may mean different things to different people. And that's just compared to regenerative agriculture, which means something different to different people in all senses of the word. And so this can make this term kind of confusing, and it can make it kind of difficult to know, if I'm doing research in regenerative agriculture, what am I doing? What blanket am I doing research under? And how can I compare that to what other people are saying? And in addition to that, if I'm speaking to growers and we're talking about doing different things under the blanket of regenerative ag, do we know what each of us is sort of speaking of in that context? And so I'm going to try to, go through a little of that here. So I would say that there was a sort of comprehensive definition of regenerative agriculture that was coined by Robert Rodale in 1983. Now, if you Google regenerative agriculture, there's a Rodale Foundation, and there's still a lot of work done from sort of this pioneering definition. And he sort of envisioned regenerative agriculture as one that, and I might even be directly quoting here, one that at increasing levels of productivity, so as farming productivity increases, you would expect to have an increase in your land and soil biological production base. So as it gets more intensive, we would have a larger production base. And what the goal was here with his first definition was that farming under regenerative agriculture practices should have this high level of economic and biological stability. So you'd expect to have fewer sort of unknown pest outbreaks, and you would hope that under regenerative agriculture, you'd also have fewer crop failures. You would expect to see your yield be more uniform. One of the other goals here of these early definitions was to produce food that was free from pesticides generally. So that sort of, was one of the early goals in these early definitions. And then the other thing is that under these practices, whatever you are doing on your farm or in your field should have minimal or at best no impact on the environment beyond that. So this idea being that you would, eliminate things like runoff, and you wouldn't have, sprays that would be ending up at your neighbor's farm, that kind of thing. So this was sort of the goal of what Robert Rodale saw as regenerative ag. And on top of that, regenerative ag has been proposed as a means of producing food that may have lower or even positive environmental and societal impacts. Now, one of the things that you'll find when you're looking up what regenerative ag, what producing food under regenerative ag can do, is that there are a lot of, I would say, I'm not going to say claims, but things that people think that if we were all sort of farming under regenerative agriculture practices that we could do. And one of the big things that authors sort of hope to see is that there's some idea that regenerative agriculture could help mitigate the effects of climate change or even reverse it. And so there are authors who claim that as sort of an outcome of farming under regenerative agriculture practices. And, some of these methods, one of the main things that often gets talked about is through carbon sequestration, and then of course other methods as well. So this was sort of where the starting point was for regenerative ag when it was really starting to come up in the literature and within news. So I got a question mark here. So since this first definition, there have been a bunch of other definitions proposed by various authors. I looked up a review article and there were 229 articles that talked about regenerative ag, whether they were research projects or just sort of talking about it as a concept. Of the 229, there were 22 that had a definition at all of regenerative ag. And so I've included a few here. And so this first one describes regenerative ag as a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. And then the second one is, again, sort of describing it as a system, a long-term holistic design. And this is talking about growing as much food using the fewest resources as possible. And again, talks about revitalizing the soil. And this one mentions carbon sequestration. And then this one actually doesn't really talk about any of the ways that you would do it, but this is more people-oriented than the other ones. And so, as you can see here, there's a lot of words here, but what you can see is, again, it means different things to different people. And I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of what I'll be talking about and a lot of what we talk about within this context does sound a lot like sustainable agriculture. And they share a lot of the same principles. And a lot of the difference that I see between them is that in sustainable ag, we don't talk as much about soil health. Now, that is something that comes up with in sustainable ag, but regenerative ag tends to be quite focused on the soil health, more so than sustainable ag. And then practitioners of regenerative agriculture see it as forward-looking, looking to improve, whereas they'll often say that sustainable ag can be viewed as an attempt to maintain a system and not necessarily improve, although, again, I mean, that's not always true, but that is sort of how people who are more proponents of the regenerative ag would see it compared to sustainable ag. Now, something else I want you to note is that all of these three definitions I have here up are outcome oriented. So they're talking about a system of principles that does something. So in that top one, that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, but it doesn't say anything about what the process is that would get you there. And so within regenerative ag, you sort of have these two competing things that the definitions often include. And so the simple way of describing this is that you have outcome-based and process-based. And so, of course, the outcomes are the main are what you're expecting to happen, and the processes are when you're farming, how can you make and I've got a list here of a shorter list of some of the main ones that we tend to see in the definitions and that we tend to see in the literature. So some of the main outcomes of using regenerative ag are to improve the ecosystem health, increase biodiversity, improve water health, improve soil health, and increase that carbon sequestration. And so if you think back to the slide I just had up, most of those definitions included these things. But there's also processes, and there are definitions of regenerative ag that do not include outcomes at all. They only talk about the processes. So here I've listed, again, the main ones that we often talk about: reducing tillage, protecting and covering the soil, use of cover crops, using crop rotations, and increasing the plant diversity. Now this slide this is not an exhaustive list, but I just wanted to show you more of the main ones that are often cited and often researched within regenerative ag, of our outcomes and our processes. Now, although I have showed you definitions that primarily include outcomes, there are also definitions, of course, that include both. And I'll go through that too in a bit. But you can see that, you know, under processes, we have things like integrating livestock into cropping systems, non-chemical pest control using compost, incorporating perennials and trees, which is the more extreme sort of polyculture. And then, of course, over on outcomes, you'll note kind of halfway down there, you'll see this maintain and increase yields, which is also a really important part of this, is that, of course, we're wanting to make the environment healthier, and we're wanting to do all of these improvements. But if you are growing food, you are concerned about making sure that you're still producing the amount of food that you need to be producing. So my research is sort of focusing on the things I have highlighted here. So it's focusing on the processes mostly, with a goal of the outcomes that I have highlighted. So my research involves reduced tillage, protecting and covering the soil. It will soon include cover crops, although not yet. And then, as I mentioned in my first slide, my lab is that non-chemical pest control is the sort of main big tent that my lab is underneath. And then for the outcomes, you can see those here. That's the outcomes that I'm looking for in my research. So as I mentioned, there's not an agreed upon definition. And one thing that I think is important, and it's something that I've read a little bit about in a lot of these papers, is that at this moment, a practitioner that is working within regenerative ag needs to come up with their own definition of what it means for them. Given that we do not have a definitive definition, I found one that I didn't come up with my own. I found one that some authors came up with that I like, and that is what my research exists underneath. So regenerative ag systems aim to increase soil quality and biodiversity in farmland while producing nourishing farm products profitably. And I like this one because it includes that profitability point, which I think is important. When we are producing food, we're often doing it because that's also our job, and we have to be able to make a living at it. And so I think that's an important part of this definition, is that we're doing all these wonderful things, which are great, but they also will continue to help us make money, if not more, when we're really using these processes. And so the unifying principles that I would include here are abandoning tillage, or for the most part, eliminating bare soil, plant diversity on the farm, and then integrating livestock and crops. Now, this is what I do. So I am working in a project where we're abandoning tillage and eliminating bare soil. Now, the other two, the fostering plant diversity on the farm, I work in high tunnels, some of which have very diverse plantings. So I do a little of that. I don't currently do anything with integrating livestock and cropping operations, but I do think my definition of regenerative ag would include those last unifying principles, even if the research that I'm currently doing does not test those at the moment. So this is my working definition. It's someone else's. It's the one I am using to what I think regenerative ag means. That does not mean it has to be your definition. Like I said, there's a lot out there. There are some nonprofits that are trying to come up with ways that you can be certified in regenerative ag. Those nonprofits will have their own definitions of what it means as well. And so the rules by which you talk about it and by which you practice it may be your own. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And I like this definition as well, because it puts together the two parts. It puts together the outcomes, increasing soil quality, biodiversity, and increasing profitability, with actual principles, actual processes. And again, in my case, abandoning tillage and eliminating bare soil. So I'm going to talk now about the project that we did last summer. So our project was really in tillage and ground covers. And tillage generally is, we use it for, seedbed preparation, and ground cover we tend to use for weed control. And of course, traditional tillage can create a lot of other issues. It can sometimes actually bring the weed seeds back up again. It can be difficult for things that are overwintering. One example that I use there, if you're doing really deep tillage, is if you're growing pumpkins or something like that, and you've got your squash bees that live in the ground. If you do too deep of tillage, you might disrupt their nests. And those are pretty important for pollination in that system. And in addition to that, it's just really hard on the soil. And again, it changes the environment for those insect pests. And it can be labor intensive, whereas no-till, although is more labor intensive potentially for planting, can be, obviously, if you just have to leave the ground alone, you don't have the labor of tillage. And so in our project this last year, we did tillage and no-till, and then we also used these ground covers. And again, those were primarily for weed control, because we are growing in a semi-organic context. And so we don't use any herbicides. And so of course, the weeds can get out of control quite quickly. So we did this project in no-till tomatoes this summer. And we did this at the U of I Sustainable Student Farm. And I have some pictures up here of my collaborators. So Carmen Ugarte and Matt Torino were my collaborators on this project. And then Augusta Kilburn is my technician. And so we all did this project together. And she did most of our trap retrieval and helping setting up plots. And we also, I should mention, we had lots of help on this project from the student farm interns this summer. And so we had 3 different plots. I'm going to show you sort of a plot map and different things. And just remember that every time I show you the one, there's actually 3 of them. And so we had 4 treatments. So like I said, we did a tillage and a no-till, and then we had ground cover. Now you'll notice here that we had black plastic ground cover with the tillage, and then landscape fabric with the no-till treatments. The black plastic ground cover gets laid when you till, and so we had to use a different ground cover. So we used a thicker landscape fabric where we weren't tilling for that particular treatment. And then we used straw ground cover for our other ground cover treatment. And of course, we had that over things that were tilled or not tilled. And so we had 6 replications of each of these across those 3 plots. Now, this is the first year we're doing this. And so we're hoping to do it for at least the next 5 years. And the way that we're going to do it is every subplot that we didn't till this year, we're not, the tillage and no-till is going to stay exactly the same. Because these methods tend not to be things that you're going to see results within, the first year, especially not at the soil level. And so we're hoping to, leave the ground alone and do this as a long-term field trial in the hopes that we'll get some really good data out of it. And I wanted to throw out some of the methods that were used, some of the varieties that we used for the tomatoes. And here's a picture of one of our plots. And like I said, I'll show you a plot map and talk a little about the size, but we had different tomato varieties. We did buffer rows. So whenever you do these field trials, you always have to have some buffer between different field plots because you never collect data in sort of the outside rows because there's edge effects and all kinds of stuff. And so you can see here where my cursor is, some of our buffer rows there. We had one on each side, and we used Pony Express and Sunrise sauce, a mix of those varieties for the tomatoes. And then the experimental rows, we had Big Beef and Mountain Fresh for our varieties. And then used a Purple Cow all-purpose potting mix. And then we used a Schaefer liquid fish fertilizer in the transplants. We did that twice. The tillage in the field was done with an immense spader. And then we did actually transfer those buffer rows earlier. We did those in late May, and then we did the experimental rows were transplanted into the field in early June. So is our plot set up. So you can see again, we've got these buffer rows, and where you see the black is an indication of either black plastic or landscape fabric. And the difference there is if we tilled it, it's black plastic. If we didn't, it's landscape fabric. And so you can see some of the sort of length, sorry about that, length of our plots here. And then you can see that we had, where I've got the tractor here that indicates tillage. And then you can sort of see the straw in the plots that had straw. And again, we had 3 sets of these that we ran this summer. So the impetus for this project was partly that we were reading a lot of popular science books that were talking about no-till and talking about regenerative ag. And a claim that comes up quite often is that if you do no tillage and you keep the ground cover and you get that soil really healthy, that you eliminate your need to spray pesticides for the foliar insect pests at all. And that was interesting to me because I could understand the notion that the soil being healthier means that your soil, if you have soil-borne pests, maybe they are better taken care of. But the correlation between the pests that are actually going to be up on your plant, eating your tomato plant, and your healthier soil, and what is the reason that pest pressure could be eliminated in those systems. And so what I was interested in, given that I'm an entomologist and I like bugs, is I was interested in, of course, those insect pests on the plant. And so with that, we did these yellow sticky cards. And so you can see them here in these pictures. So yellow sticky cards, some of you guys might be using them anyway for monitoring. They are you just put them in the field, and then some insects are actually attracted to the yellow. And so they'll actually come in, and then some will just, hit it and it's sticky. We did have some issue occasionally with butterflies getting stuck, but I will tell you, we were able to remove the butterflies and they flew away. And that was really nice because it was good. If we're talking about regenerative ag and we're wanting to increase biodiversity, of course, we want our monitoring tools to not be detrimental to things in the environment. And so we'd occasionally get a monarch stuck on there and we could actually rescue them from those traps, which was fantastic. So on top of the yellow sticky cards to be monitoring the bugs, I also did plant counts where I went to every plant and I counted if I found certain predators or if I found pests that were unlikely to be on the sticky cards. We did take soil cores. My collaborator, Carmen Ugarte, is the one that's doing the soil work. And so those results will be coming later. We don't have all the analyses done there yet, but we are doing soil cores so we can measure soil health. And then we also took marketable yield of tomatoes, because at the end of the day, if we can get the soil healthier and also have either the same amount of tomatoes or more, that's really the ultimate goal of this type of research. So today I will talk about, when I'm talking about results here, I will talk about the yellow sticky cards, and then we'll also talk about the marketable yield of the tomatoes. So I think this is another good time. This is a good time to mention, there's of course a lot of insect pests. We're working on tomatoes, and there's a lot of insect pests, and there's a lot of things that, depending on the year, can be a problem or not. And so I went out and did these plant counts where I would go around every tomato plant and try to assess who was on it. I'm not going to show you any of that data because ultimately there wasn't as much out there in a repeatedly. So sometimes I'd find a fair amount of things. I've got a picture here on the left of these striped armyworms. This is actually in our high tunnel. It was interesting this year. We did high tunnel research and we did this open field tomato research. And in the high tunnels, we actually had worse armyworm pressure than we did in the open fields. And so I just didn't find that many of them. And then, on our sticky traps, we had flea beetles. When you're growing tomatoes, when you're growing really any nightshades, potatoes, any of those, you tend to have flea beetles. But again, they weren't in that high of numbers. We also had, some Colorado potato beetles, but again, not very many, just a few. And they weren't, the other thing is they were all kind of in one plot. They weren't really correlated with any of our treatments. And then the other thing that we found quite often was these corn rootworm beetles. And those guys will show up sometimes in tomato. They didn't seem to be doing any damage. And then of course, this guy here on the right, the tomato hornworm or tobacco hornworm. We did find a fair number of those, but as anybody who grows tomatoes knows, you often just manually remove those from the plants. And we did that. And they weren't in huge numbers. Again, they seem to be in bigger numbers this year in our high tunnels than they were in our open fields, which was interesting. And the picture I have there is actually on potato. So that was a whole bunch about the pests I'm not going to talk about, although they are in fact, in the system, and we did see them this year. These are the pests I'm going to talk about. And part of this is because these are the pests that end up on the yellow sticky traps, and they end up in pretty high numbers. And so because I wasn't finding that many things just on the foliage when I was doing my counts, the majority of the data that we'll talk about will be of these pests. And so I'm going to go through them here for you. So on the upper left here is the potato leafhopper. And these we found in quite large numbers this year. And then here in the center and on the right are aphids. And of course, aphids also transmit diseases. So they're a group that they transmit mosaic viruses. And so they're a group that we're always interested in monitoring. And then down here are white flies. And then this middle here and the bottom are thrips. I always say, in case you don't know, one thrips is a thrips and many thrips are thrips. The name of it has an S on it. One of the reasons why we study these pests, in addition to the fact that they were in large numbers, is that these pests tend to be, and maybe with the exception of these leafhoppers here, these other ones tend to be ones that when you spray broad spectrum insecticides, you can get outbreaks of them. Sometimes when you spray a broad spectrum to control aphids, the aphids are actually worse after you spray them before. And we think that this is related, or there's some good evidence to suggest that because natural enemies, the good bugs, if you will, that are out there eating these pests seem to be more susceptible to broad spectrum insecticides, the sprays actually take out the natural enemies more so than they do these pests. And so then you'll have these extra outbreaks. And so if the regenerative ag processes of getting that soil really healthy can help to knock out some of the insect pests, hopefully it's things like this that we sometimes have some trouble when we try to spray, because we're hoping to, eliminate the issue of insecticide sprays anyway, and they're not as effective against these pests sometimes. Now that's not, I don't mean that to be a blanket statement. There are broad spectrums that will control thrips, that will control aphids, but as a general idea, these groups do tend to outbreak more after broad spectrum insecticides than something like a caterpillar would. Oh, sorry. All right. So this is my first result that I'm going to show you today. And I just want to orient you here. So this is, you see these pictures of these pests over here. This is everybody combined. And so this is the mean pests per trap per season. And again, we had we had a trap in each plot, and we picked those up every single week. So we had a lot of sampling for this summer. And so we've got our thrips, whiteflies, aphids, and potato leafhoppers here. So again, this was the first year for this project. And what we found is that generally speaking, although not different from the tillage straw, generally speaking, our plots where we did not till them and we put straw ground cover had the fewest insect pests across the board. Now they weren't actually different than this kind of teal one you see here where we did tillage and had straw ground cover. And so what this told us is that this year, what was really affecting our pest pressure was in fact not necessarily the tillage, but the ground cover itself. So really where this difference is coming from is that when you have straw ground cover, you have fewer pests. And where you have a fabric or a plastic ground cover, you have more. And so that was sort of the trend we saw in this first year. Now, the fact that numerically our no-till straw plot, which we would consider to be our sort of most regenerative ag plot, if you will, the best processes in that context being no-till and having a straw ground cover as opposed to something that doesn't break down. The fact that numerically it had fewer pests was really good news for us. This was very exciting. And we would not have expected, honestly, we would not have expected to see a difference in tillage in this first year. We've only tilled it once. We imagine that this no-till is more of a long-term process to get these pest numbers down and have an effective tillage as opposed to the effective ground cover. Now, we think maybe what's happening with the ground cover is straw ground cover is thick, and it probably can allow predators to have harborage. and sort of hang out in there. And so we think maybe what's happening is in straw ground cover, you just have more natural enemies living in the straw. They can't really live in the plastic and the fabric. There's no place for them to be. And so they're just closer to the plant when you're using this straw system. And so we think maybe that's where some of these effects are coming from. But I did want to break it down because I thought that was kind of important. You know, with things like this, sometimes it can be one group that's really influencing everything, and there's, you know, one group of pests are really low and the other ones are not. Well, in this case, 3 out of our 4 groups had lower pest pressure on our no-till straw. So to orient you here, we've got sort of the same axis here, mean pest per trap per season. And then my color system is the same as it was in the last slide, but I did add this hatching where we have straw. And so you've got your tilled plastic, your tilled straw here, and then you got no-till fabric and no-till straw then on the far right. And so here, this upper left is aphids, upper right is potato leafhoppers, lower left is whiteflies, and lower left is thrips. So you can see that for aphids, again, numerically the fewest in that no-till straw, and it was significantly different from that tilled plastic. It was also significantly different than our tilled plastic and no-till fabric for potato leafhoppers. Again, numerically the lowest pests there. Whiteflies, we saw a lot of pests in our no-till fabric, a lot of whiteflies, but again, we're seeing fewer in these straw covered ones, and the fewest where we didn't till. The only place that this does not fit is thrips. And I will say that it does seem like thrips are just kind of everywhere. And there was absolutely no effect of any of our treatments on the thrips populations. And they were just kind of always with us, which is something that I have seen in other studies as well. And it is kind of a truism if you run a greenhouse that you almost always just have thrips. And so, you know, it's a pest to concentrate on as far as other control methods would be going forward to see what we can actually do about the thrips. Because it seems like with the other pests, some of our, you know, regenerative ag processes might be having a nice effect on bringing those populations down, whereas they're doing nothing to the thrips. And then, of course, the other thing that is important, and of course is really important from a grower context, is that yield. And so again, I just want to stress that this is our first year of this, and so the results that we've seen so far have been promising, but I'll just go ahead and show you the yield. So again, to orient you to this graph here, we have our mean marketable yield on the left there. And this is not in pounds, it's in number of fruit, I believe. And this is overall the whole season. And so you can see here on the left, again, I've used the same color coding that I've used for everything else. Oh, wait. So you see this tilled plastic, the tilled straw, the no-till fabric, and the no-till straw. And you can see there was no difference in yield. Now, I'm not surprised by this. Again, in year 1, if we're assuming that our yield will go up as our soil gets healthier, we've only had 1 year where we're not tilling that soil. And so I would expect that as time goes on, we would see more of an effect. Now, I can't say for sure whether or not that effect will come from our ground cover or our tillage. I would expect a little of both, of course, and that's the goal. The goal here, of course, is to have this purple bar on the right, our no-till straw bar, have the highest yield, fewest pests, because those treatments fit in to a regenerative ag context best. And so we're going to be continuing this kind of as long as we can. And so we're gonna be doing this next year at the farm. and then we're going to actually expand it out. So my conclusion from this season is our least intensely managed plots, which I'm calling our best example of a regenerative ag plot, which were our no-till plots covered in straw, had the least insect pest pressure, sort of across the board. Now, of course, like I said, that didn't include thrips, but it kind of included everybody else. And we see this as a really, really great starting point for this project. And so, as I mentioned, we think maybe it's predator harborages. It also could just be temperature as well. And that the flat black plastic maybe is a little bit more reflective, maybe other things, these small pests are coming in because of that. There's a lot of explanations for this that we're hoping to dig deeper into as the next seasons go on. But next season, we're going to continue with those tomatoes, and then we're going to expand out to cucumbers. So I mentioned earlier that I had been reading these different sort of books that were for a general audience about these topics. And one of the claims that really stood out to me was a cucumber grower that said once the soil was healthy, they no longer had to spray insecticides for cucumber beetles, which is great, but cucumber beetles are attracted to a chemical cucumbers produce. And so unless somehow the healthy soil stops that production or does something else, I want to know what the mechanism of that is. Whereas tomatoes don't have quite as much of that, where cucumbers, clearly the cucumber beetle is attracted to cucumbers because of the chemical they produce. And so we want to test these questions and these treatments on cucumbers as well. So we'll be doing both from now on. And so next year will be our first year working with cucumbers. The other thing we're going to add, and something that I talked about on an earlier slide, is we're going to add cover crop as an additional ground cover treatment, living cover crop. So we're going to plant a clover in the hopes that instead of doing straw and instead of doing landscape fabric or any of those other things, that we have this living cover crop that will be perennial, so that we can just keep planting into it once it establishes. The sort of best case scenario would be it would establish and we could just plant into it year after year. And so that's an additional treatment we'll be adding to not only the tomatoes, but also the cucumbers. Just testing a few more of these processes within the regenerative agriculture context. And then I always mention the molecular gut content analysis, which is, I'm always interested in what the predators are doing, what predatory bugs and spiders are actually doing in the field, and how they can help us control pests, if you will. And just because a predator like a lady beetle is in the field with an aphid doesn't necessarily mean that predator is eating that aphid. And so I collect predators from the field, I crunch them up, and I look for pest DNA in their guts so that I can say whether or not predators are helping us with control. And that will be really relevant if what is happening in the straw treatments is that there are more predators in those straw treatments and they're hanging out in those harborages and they're coming up onto the plants and eating more of our pests. When I do the gut content analysis, I'll be able to say, yes, these things I collected in the straw were in fact eating aphids or thrips or whiteflies or something like that. And so that's another piece that I'll be adding to this going forward that I did not actually get a chance to do this year. And so results of all of that coming soon. But I think that sort of the overall conclusion is that we have really promising results with our first couple of processes that we are testing in a regenerative ag context. And as time goes on, I'm hoping to be able to test some of those bigger outcomes and maybe be able to report on all of that. And with that, I want to leave my contact information up there. So if you'd like to contact me for anything, if you've got bug problems, my email is there, and there are 2 phone numbers there. And actually the second one is a better one. That's my cell phone. It's an easier way to contact me. And so go ahead and, feel free to use either of those forms if you have any questions, or again, if you're having insect trouble and you think I can help. And so I will, if there's questions in the chat, I can take those.
Perfect. Yes, we've got some questions. I tried to group them kind of based on where you were at in your presentation, Casey. And so I thought what we would start with is kind of about your research project. There was a question asking, was any adjacent non-tested fields that were tested as a control for your research project?
So we didn't really collect insects in anything that we weren't doing the treatments to. So no, we did not have a control because we do have some buffer meadows, but on the sustainable farm, a lot of the stuff that was right next to us was also tomatoes. So there were tomatoes and peppers near. There were some eggplants near where our plots were. 2 of our plots were near each other and a third one was kind of far away. And so we didn't really have, aside from just meadow, we didn't really have like a control. We didn't have anything that was bare ground either. And that's part of that is just because with weed control, you've got to make sure that you have any cover. So no, we don't have anything that we would consider a control. We sort of viewed the tilled plastic cover as kind of a control, as sort of the most intensely managed, the most common thing that people might do if they're using ground cover. And so we kind of viewed that as like the default kind of.
Okay. Was there anything that was looking at the input costs that were including things like labor, especially with those different treatments are going to have different labor inputs? Was that a factor within it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we did not do that last year, but I'm going to do that this year, and especially with figuring out the amount of people hours we put into that. So for the straw, the other thing that I should mention is when we planted, we actually did it by hand. Now, of course, you can no-till plant transplants. People do that, but because of the interns on the farm, we had enough people to go in and actually hand transplant. But next year, I'm going to keep track of the amount of people hours that it takes to do this, and then also calculating how much it costs to buy the straw, how much it costs to buy the different ground covers, and keeping in mind too that with landscape fabric you can use it more than 1 year, and the straw, whatever we have left, we might try to use it, but we'll have to have more. So it's a great question, and we are going to be looking at that at least in sort of raw numbers next year.
Is there anything with this study that this kind of combines a couple of different comments in our chat box that's looking at, say, soil biology, diseases, even the nutrient quality of what's being grown? Is there anything kind of trying to get out every piece?
Yeah. So with the diseases right now, we don't have anybody on the disease side, although we have talked about it, and we might recruit somebody for this coming season. All the soil stuff we're absolutely doing. So Carmen is doing the soil sort of nutrient quality analysis now. We're actually going to take samples to do the community of arthropods that are in the soil. We're going to be doing some pitfall trapping next year to do whoever's running around on the surface. Now, we haven't talked about doing anything related to the nutrients in the actual plant. And we have not done anything with whether or not, given the same varieties, somehow there would be different taste in a tomato that was grown differently. We're not doing any of that at the moment, but we're not against doing a variety of other things. And the diseases being one that we have actually thought about that one quite a bit. We just don't have anybody yet on board there. But the soil stuff, absolutely. So those results, she's got all of it. And, the analysis of these things often take time.
Yeah,
so
and I know Carmen, and Carmen might be a great addition next year.
Yeah, no, I mean, she's the collaborator. We're writing grants together. We're on this. I'm just the bug lady.
Right. Yeah, we were getting a lot of questions about bricks and in soil. And yes, I mean, as a soil researcher myself, I know that we do all of that. So I think
and I'm really excited about that. We thought maybe we'd have some results for this by now, and we just didn't. That's just, sort of the way that it goes. And we're going to take, I think we're taking more samples. So I think we did 3 soil cores this year. We did sort of the before, the middle, and the after. And I think next year we're going to do a bit more. But again, even though the plots aren't big, there's kind of a lot of them. So we're, working with what we can work with right now. But yeah, and I actually had not considered until that question from the chat, things like nutrients in the plant or bricks or any of that. And that's kind of an interesting thought that I hadn't considered that angle as time goes on.
One of the other kind of statements we had is, as you're thinking about even just preparing a no-till plot, how do you prepare a ground for that? And that being said, one of our earlier questions was like, how are you even maybe defining no-till and soil management and regenerative agriculture approach?
Yeah, so in our no-till stuff, we are like basically, not tilling it at all, like just leaving it. We are doing cover crops though. And we are doing, because pretty much at the farm, there's always cover crops. So whether or not the way that we're killing those to then do the next season. But in this case, it's because there's different levels of tillage, of course. And our plots are just left alone, aside from the fact that obviously we have to dig them out to put the plants in. That's the most disturbance that soil is getting. Aside from when we're planting in, obviously the cover crops and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's an extreme, like we're not doing anything to it.
Okay. So no, like any like broad fork or anything like that. You're not even doing that. Okay. And kind of thinking about, what you've talked about today, and especially introducing this concept and helping us to understand more about it. What's realistic, thinking about like not necessarily on, a large scale, but maybe even just someone wanting to get started on what are some realistic methods that can be used? And then what even might we even try to aspire towards in some way?
Yeah, I think that the realistic things really are the reducing your tillage down and trying to use some kind of ground cover, whatever that is, as sort of first steps, which are always the first steps. I think that aspiring to things like a more of a polyculture, even if that means you're rotating out, because here in Illinois, and obviously, we have certain crops that a lot of people grow because they are the money makers. And especially, I work in high tunnels, and in high tunnels, we're going to grow tomatoes. But I think sort of the pie in the sky is that as we are making the soil healthier and doing all that sort of thing, even if we're doing minimal rotations, getting more rotations in, growing some different crops, and keeping the ground covered all the time. Like the goal is never have bare soil. I think that is even when you're getting started, once you get one way that you can kill weeds, that you can prepare the ground ahead of time, you can pile cardboard on the ground and let it sit to kill, some of the stuff that's already there if you're just getting started. But I think that I really think the goal for me in what I think a lot of people could do is just no bare ground. Because that does a lot of things that's good for the ecosystem. And then, obviously, I don't imagine that the world of woody polyculture and growing trees and annuals together is necessarily going to work. But it is an interesting idea. I think more likely we're going to end up with, more diversified farms is a better goal.
Great. There was a couple of questions about, the use of, say, the plasticulture system. And we know that some are trying to kind of move away from that. Is there anything, especially in this study, that might even be looking at the impact of how it might be breaking down in the soil, or, how we might need to think about utilizing a plastic system too?
Yeah, so we're not doing a lot of that, but I do think that's a big problem. For me, is the idea of using something that is, especially a big piece of plastic, that, there's the biodegradable ones and things like that that are more expensive or the ones that break down better. And those are a better way to go. I think that, our use of plasticulture here in this experiment is to try to use that as a comparison to other things that are better environmentally. But we're not currently looking at any of the breakdown of those things. The landscape fabric that we use on the farm, we use over and over again. And so, and they will use that. So if the landscape fabric got to the point where it wasn't as usable, in the field where we were actually growing stuff, then Matt will put that on other things as a cover to kill a cover crop or weeds or something else to prepare a bed for something else. Of course, we have the luxury on the farm of being able to have areas that we can leave alone for a while or that we can have in cover crop. But yeah, I do think the plasticulture is not ideal for all the environmental reasons.
Great. I think that wraps up as many questions as we can get right now. So thank you again, Kacie, for being with us today, presenting your research and really helping us to understand more critically about this very important topic.